Earlier this year, a war broke out that shut down one of the busiest oil corridors on the planet. Within days, the price of crude spiked past levels the world hadn't seen since the 2008 financial crisis. If you drive a car, you probably remember filling up and wincing at the number on the pump. If you don't remember it at all, that's actually the whole point of this video. Because by the time summer arrived, oil prices had already quietly slid back down to almost exactly where they started. The panic came. The panic went. Everyone exhaled. But something else happened during those months that never made a single headline, and it is still happening right now, sitting quietly inside your bank account. The safest feeling place for your money is slowly making you poorer. Let me show you what that actually looks like, not as a theory but as a person. Picture someone we'll call Elena. 6 years ago, she did the thing everyone tells you to do. She had $20,000 saved, the first real cushion of her adult life, and she was proud of it. Not invested. Not gambled. Sitting safe in a savings account where nothing could touch it. She checked the balance sometimes just to look at it. $20,000. Proof that she had finally gotten her life under control. That number is still there today. It has never once gone down. And she is meaningfully poorer than she was the day she deposited it. Nothing was stolen. No crash, no scam, no bad decision. The number on her screen never moved. But the world around that number moved a great deal, and by the time she noticed, 6 years of quiet erosion had already happened. We'll come back to Elena, and to exactly what those $20,000 can and cannot buy her now. First, the man who spent 50 years warning about exactly this. Ray Dalio started Bridgewater Associates out of a 2-bedroom apartment in 1975 and built it into the largest hedge fund on Earth, one that produced roughly $53 billion in cumulative gains for its investors, with an average return near 12%, and remarkably, a positive return in 2008, the exact year the stock market fell by almost 40%. But long before any of that, before he had real money at all, Dalio started asking himself one blunt question over and over for years. How many months could you survive if the money stopped coming in tomorrow? Hold onto that number. You'll need it again before this video is over. That question wasn't an abstract exercise for him. Dalio has described living through the entire arc himself. Years with nothing, then plenty, then eventually enough that the question stopped being about survival and started being about legacy. He says the counting habit never left him, because the number that actually matters was never how much you have sitting in an account. It's how long that amount can genuinely carry you if everything else stopped tomorrow. Here's the part that sounds backwards. You've probably been taught, without anyone ever saying it out loud, that cash is the responsible choice. It doesn't crash. It doesn't swing wildly overnight. The number in your account never falls on its own. Dalio says that feeling is exactly the trap. Cash, he argues, is the worst investment over a long, long period of time, because inflation quietly eats it away. Not a crash, not a headline, a slow leak you can't see, hear, or feel happening in real time. And here's the detail that makes the leak so easy to miss. Say your bank pays you 4% interest a year, which is roughly what a decent savings account offers right now. Meanwhile, inflation is running close to that same 4%. So your real gain, before anything else is subtracted, is close to zero. Then comes the part almost nobody accounts for. The government still taxes you on that 4%, as if you actually earned something, even though, adjusted for what your money can buy, you gained essentially nothing at all. You end up paying taxes on a profit that never really existed. Why does this fool almost everyone? Because the number visible to you only ever goes up. Nobel-winning psychologist Daniel Kahneman spent decades studying exactly this kind of blind spot. Losses loom larger than gains, he found, meaning the pain of watching a number shrink hits the brain far harder than the pleasure of watching the same number grow. Cash exploits that wiring perfectly. It never visibly drops, so your brain quietly files it under safe, Even while its real value, what it can actually buy you next year, is bleeding out the entire time. Elena's brain did exactly that every time she opened the app and saw the same reassuring number. To see how dangerous that invisible bleed can get when it's left unchecked, you have to go back 50 years, to the last time an oil shock rattled the world economy anywhere close to the way this year's did. In October 1973, an oil embargo sent the price of crude from around $3.77 a barrel to above $12 within months, roughly quadrupling almost overnight. Gas lines stretched around entire city blocks. Countries like Britain and France rationed fuel outright. The United States imposed price controls, trying to freeze the pain in place. And what followed wasn't a sharp shock that faded fast. It was nearly a full decade of something economists call stagflation. High inflation and a stalling economy happening at the exact same time. A combination so rare and so painful that, before it happened, most economics textbooks assumed it simply couldn't occur. Think about what a decade of that does to someone like Elena. Not a single dramatic day. Just year after year where the same wage buys a slightly smaller cart of groceries, and the savings account that felt like an achievement in year 1 feels like a joke by year 9. Part of what made that decade so brutal is a psychological trap of its own. Once people expect prices to keep rising, researchers have found that expectation becomes self-fulfilling. Workers demand higher wages to keep up, businesses raise prices to cover the higher wages, and the cycle feeds itself, faster and faster, with no single villain pulling the lever. Here's the twist almost nobody tells you about that decade, and it is the single most important idea in this entire video. Researchers at the Dallas Federal Reserve went back through the historical data decades later and found something uncomfortable. The great inflation of the 1970s didn't actually start with the oil embargo. Much of the surge had already begun before oil even quadrupled in price. What truly lit the fuse was a large monetary expansion the Federal Reserve had agreed to back in 1971, followed by a second round of the same expansion later in the decade. In other words, the oil shock was the spark. The fire was fed somewhere else entirely, by the response to economic pain, not the pain itself. A policy meant to keep the economy comfortable in the short term ended up reigniting the very inflation it was supposedly trying to avoid. This matters today because it's the exact same mechanism Ray Dalio is warning about right now, just wearing a different decade's clothes. His worry isn't that a government simply runs out of money one day. It's what a government and the central bank behind it tends to do next. When debts and shortfalls pile up high enough, he explains, it's the central bank that eventually steps in to create more of the currency out of thin air to cover the gap. And when more currency exists chasing the same amount of goods and services, every single dollar you already own quietly becomes worth a little less than it was the day before. Put your money goggles on for a second. The shock you see on the news is almost never the real threat to your savings. The response to that shock, unfolding quietly for years afterward, is what actually decides whether your money survives it. Now, to be fair, today's world isn't a perfect rerun of the 1970s, and a fair account has to say so. Modern economies use far less oil per dollar of output than they did 50 years ago, and higher energy prices can now even accelerate investment into alternative energy sources. When a comparable energy shock rattled global markets in 2022, prices climbed, but it did not spiral into a decade-long stagflation crisis the way the 1970s did. History doesn't repeat itself, as the old saying goes, but it does seem to rhyme, and the specific note it keeps rhyming on is this one. The visible shock fades fast, while the policy response to it lingers for years, quietly sitting inside the value of your savings long after the headlines have moved on to the next story. Which brings this back to earlier this year. That oil shock in the headlines saw Brent crude spike past $120 a barrel, briefly touching roughly $141 at its peak, the highest level since 2008. The World Bank cut its global growth forecast down to 2.5%, the lowest since the pandemic. And in effect, nobody connected to oil prices at the time. A family buying a $400,000 home with a standard down payment saw their monthly mortgage payment climb by roughly $110, purely from the ripple of higher interest rates moving through the economy. Then, right on schedule, by early July, Brent crude had already fallen back under $71 a barrel, almost exactly where it sat the day before the fighting began. Analysts were quick to caution that the calm wasn't necessarily stable or permanent. But the visible crisis had already passed by the time most people had even fully registered it. Meanwhile, the quieter number, the one that never made a single headline, kept doing its work the entire time. Every dollar sitting untouched in a savings account through those months bought a little less than it did back in February. War or no war, headline or no headline. Which is where Elena finally gets her answer. Her $20,000 is still $20,000. But run it forward through 6 years of ordinary inflation, the unremarkable kind nobody writes headlines about, and what that money can actually buy has quietly shrunk by thousands. Same number on the screen. Noticeably smaller life behind it. And here's the part that stings. If you asked her when she lost that money, she couldn't tell you. There was no day. No crash, no notification, no moment of panic to point at. It happened in 1,000 invisible installments, on ordinary Tuesdays, while she was doing everything she'd been told was responsible. This is exactly the pattern author Morgan Housel writes about in his work on long-term financial behavior. Humans are wired to notice sudden, dramatic events. We are nearly blind to slow, compounding ones. A market crash gets a headline, a push notification, and a wave of panic. A currency quietly losing a few percent of its value every single year for a decade gets nothing. No alarm, no app notification, no evening news segment. And yet, over enough years, that quiet leak can do more lasting damage to your actual wealth than most crashes ever will. Dalio draws a sharp line between wealth and money that's worth sitting with for a second. Wealth, he points out, is not the same thing as money. You can look wealthy on paper while owning nothing you can actually spend, because you can only spend money, and turning wealth into money means selling it, at whatever price the market happens to be offering that day. He watched that exact mechanism nearly break the financial system in 2008, as one of the very few investors who saw it coming. And he says the pattern always plays out the same way. People get excited about a genuinely revolutionary technology. Prices climb. Eventually, people start borrowing against those rising, unspent gains to buy even more of the same thing. It works beautifully while prices keep climbing. Then taxes change, or interest rates rise, or confidence simply cracks. And the same borrowing that inflated the bubble now forces people to sell into a falling market just to cover their debts, which pushes prices down even further on the way out. It's the same shock versus response pattern from the 1970s, just running through stock prices instead of oil prices. So what does someone who has spent 5 decades studying exactly this actually do about it? Dalio's answer isn't a stock tip or a prediction. He's remarkably blunt that even the most sophisticated professional investors struggle to time exactly when a bubble bursts or a currency turns. His answer is structural, not predictive. Spread your money across things that tend to move differently from one another, so that when one part is quietly losing real value, another part isn't. Gold is the example he keeps returning to. Not because it's exciting, but precisely because it isn't tied to any single country's currency and can't simply be printed into existence the way money can. He treats it less like a bet and more like an insurance policy sitting in the corner of a portfolio. And he's careful to frame all of it as one piece of a much bigger picture, never a single silver bullet. He says he's watching several forces converge at once, including what he calls classic signs of a new investment bubble forming elsewhere. Which is exactly why he keeps circling back to the same word, diversify rather than predict. So here's that number again, the one you were asked to hold onto at the very start of this video. How many months could you actually survive if the money stopped arriving tomorrow? Most people have never actually done that math once in their life. Fewer still have done it a second way, not counting dollars, but counting what those dollars can actually buy after a few years of quiet inflation have chipped away at them. That second number is almost always smaller and scarier than the first one. It's also the one that actually matters. You don't need to predict the next oil shock, the next war, or the next Federal Reserve decision to protect yourself from any of this. What you can do tonight takes about 2 minutes. Take your current balance and divide it by what you actually spend each month. That gives you Dalio's number, how many months you could survive if nothing else came in. Then run the second calculation almost nobody bothers to do. Take that same balance and subtract a reasonable inflation estimate, 3 or 4% a year, from its buying power, and look honestly at what it adds up to 5 years from now if it just sits there earning close to nothing in real terms. You don't have to do anything dramatic with that answer tonight. You just need to stop mistaking a number that never visibly falls for a number that never actually shrinks. Elena's $20,000 never once went down. That was exactly the problem. The safest place for your money was never your bank account. It's finally seeing, clearly, what your bank account is quietly worth. If this video changed how you look at the number sitting in your account, share it with the one person you know who still thinks cash is the safe choice. A new Money Goggles video every single week.